And we're good. So I guess on behalf of the advisory group, I'll get this started. Trustee Warren, like I mentioned, will be joining us slightly late, different obligations for the first part of the meeting, but he can catch up for sure. I'm just going to go through similar to what I did last meeting and just go through a presentation kind of summarizing what was in the packet materials and then kind of leading it up to you guys at the end for some discussion and hopefully some recommendations for the board for their August 3rd meeting. There's 2 items on the agenda tonight. One is parking, so on-street overnight parking is coming back. And then we're going to introduce the concept of modifying the ADA parking requirements in the village that the village manager has prepared, but I will be presenting unless she has a chance to join us, but I'm happy to do so. So without further ado, let me try to find the right thing to share. So hopefully you're all seeing an opening slide on parking implementation. Yep, okay. So I'll try to rattle through these as best as I can. If you have any questions, feel free to pop up in between, whatever works best. So just as a reminder, the technical advisory group is made up of these individuals providing their perspectives from their representative groups. I don't need to go through the list. You've all probably met each other several times. So just as a reminder of who else you're dealing with tonight. A broad overview, the key goals of the implementation for the analysis, I should say, was to improve communication, improve accessibility, improve standardization, and improve enforcement. So those are kind of the 4 overarching themes that we're looking to with any sort of modification or improvement that we make. So just as a general overview, once again, the village does restrict overnight parking unless you have a permit between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. Monday through Friday. Your on-street permit options are temporary, 20 per year for free. Those do administratively cost the village. And so as we've discussed in previous meetings, there's kind of a notion of why do we charge anything for parking or how much do we charge less? Just so you know, there are costs to a lot of these things. So the temporary ones, they're offered for free, but they do, I believe it's $1 per offering. So the village absorbs that within other revenue sources that we have. So those are temporarily free to the resident. We do also provide hardship on a qualifying basis at $50 a month. That allows you to park on the street, you know, wherever you need to near your apartment or home or duplex or whatnot. But it's only for those that qualify for it. So you have to have a small driveway or small garage, things like that, or lack of driveway or garage. And then we also allow special permits through our multifamily landlords at $50 a month. Those are limited to our commercial corridors primarily. They have an occupancy cap on them. So it's not that everyone who lives in those apartment buildings can get one. Every building is provided a certain amount that the landlords then allocate however they choose, most likely on a first come, first served basis. But once again, limited options. And then we do have off-street lots, public and private at $50 a month or $75 for 24 hours. So that's the current situation of what we're dealing with. As we discussed in our last meeting, there's several options to move that forward. One of the primary slides that came up within our conversation and at the board was a conversation of equity. And just in going through the comprehensive planning process right now, balancing homeowner and resident needs has always been a challenge in Shorewood. And so these statistics kind of stuck out for a lot of people. So I just wanted to reinsert them here for our conversation. We are a primarily renter occupied community, and we do offer limited on-street parking and off-street parking at $50 a month in comparison to our neighbors to the north and south. So the idea of balancing those needs is kind of in the back of everyone's minds within these conversations. After our June 24th committee, our TAG meeting, I presented the same information to the committee of the whole, which is the village board. They also gave general consensus to consider offering an on-street overnight parking permit. However, there was no consensus on price. There were some perspectives that they needed to be high enough to, you know, not overrun the streets with cars. Other people thought that they should be lower because it's a need for a lot of people. So it was kind of on both sides of the perspective. There was also a desire by some to limit it per household, thinking that sometimes duplexes or apartments or even houses might have, you know, 4, 5, 6 cars, be that as it may, depending on the number of people living in them. So they thought that would be something worth pursuing that would require residency validation under any sort of circumstance. So that's a whole another level of administration. There was also some concern expressed over parking capacity in the business district, just because that's where most of the apartment buildings are located. And so by allowing unlimited number of permits, those residents could potentially park up the business district starting as soon as 6 p.m., not move their cars until 10 a.m. based on current daytime regulations, and how that might impact the businesses that are there. So that's one of their ongoing discussions as well. There was a discussion of preferred implementation for January 1st, 2021. We can't do it any sooner, and that would be a good cutoff year. I know the tag had requested for as soon as possible, so this kind of, there's your as soon as possible kind of date. It does require some software updates, a lot of communication, obviously. So January 1st, 2021 would be the date that we'd be looking for, if any. So an overview of the implementation strategy, we would replace existing hardship and special permits. Those are currently limited in quantity and administratively burdensome. We would keep the off-street public and private parking lot options, but we might consider adjusting the cost. The analysis suggested that those off-street lot options should always be cheaper than the on-street option. That incentivizes people to use them, and so it keeps the streets more clear if that is the goal, and it is one of our stated goals, both for DPW and for some resident preferences. Not everyone's preference, obviously. So they've suggested that we keep that lower than the on-street option if we offer one. We'd also maintain the allowance for 20 free temporary permissions. Oddly enough, in the survey that I included within your packet, a lot of people might not be aware of that option because some people requested an option for 1 or 2 free days a year. We already actually do have that. So communication, once again, might be necessary. In order to implement these suggestions, we would need to adopt an ordinance, which would change the village code, and adopt a policy, which would dictate how staff administers that code, and then adopt a resolution, which would include any fee schedule changes that we would have. So just administratively, this is what we're dealing with as staff. If we were to do that, we would need those 3 pieces of legislation move forward. And then, yeah, so we'll keep going through the presentation. So the first concept that came up from the village board was whether or not to require residency requirements. The analysis did recommend that. Staff voiced objection to that throughout the process, but the consultants did indicate that that is a standard and or typical option for communities as they introduce these things to make sure that the, you know, whoever is, and Trustee Warren's going to join us here, whoever is purchasing the permit lives in the village. We did voice objection to that. It does cause a lot of administrative needs. I followed up with the customer service staff who does this. They indicate that 33 to 40% of their day can be spent on parking issues, believe it or not. And the deputy clerk, who is their manager, spends 10 to 15% of her time also, you know, interacting with those issues or complaints. So adding a residency requirement to an expanded permit would likely expand the administration of that. And whether or not it's necessary is a larger question for us. We think that there's people in the village who either work here or maybe you know, visit here frequently enough that wouldn't need to prove residency to park on the street if they're willing to pay for the permit. So it is possible through our software and administratively, but that it does come at a cost. The study recommended 2 forms of ID. At a minimum, we would suggest only 1. 2 forms are more than required for voter registration, and so we don't see why parking in the village should be more stringent than that. And we would recommend that it be valid for 12 months. There's some systems where you enter it once and you're valid, but then if you move, who knows? So if we're gonna do it, we would recommend that they be valid for 12 months. For reference sake, I was asked to follow up with the City of Milwaukee. The City of Milwaukee does not require residency to purchase a permit. They do have a disclaimer on their purchasing software that you claim that you are a resident, and so that's how they cover it, but they don't administratively, you know, check your license or your lease agreement. They did also indicate that they do run into problems from time to time, specifically with Shorewood and Wauwatosa, because we don't offer permits, that people in Shorewood and Wauwatosa actually purchase the Milwaukee permit at the $55 cost, which is quite reasonable, park in the City of Milwaukee and then walk up to Shorewood or Wauwatosa. So the fact that we don't offer it actually is problematic for them. And if we would offer it, we might be alleviating some of that burden for them as well. long story short, and the staff remains opposed. But as we'll see with other recommendations, this is something that could be built in later on. We think there will be, some growing pains with the introduction of this, and whether that's changing the cost or changing residency or household limitations. We just don't want to overbuild the system if we don't have to. And so our recommendation would once again be to not require it at this time. Household limitations were also brought up, I think both by the advisory group and by the village board. The analysis recommended that 2 per household be allowed. That would require the proof of residency. So going back to the first step of this, if we do this, we have to do that. So administration, once again, would be quite significant. Milwaukee does not limit their overnight parking permits. They do for their daytime, which they feel is more valid in terms of people, perhaps trying to park near employers or employment bases, but they think overnight it has not been a problem where they've limited it. So they do not offer limitations for household night parking. Staff remains once again opposed within the initial permit launch. That's just staff's perspective. Once again, the advisory group can say what they want and the board can pass what they want. We're just here providing perspective of what it means from a day-to-day standpoint of people that work in the village. There was also a question on parking supply in terms of the business district. And so I'm here to remind both this group and the board that the analysis did include a supply analysis. So at 7 p.m., there were a few portions of the business district that were over capacity or at capacity, 85 to 100%. Those are primarily in the north section of the Oakland Avenue corridor, and then further south as well. So those primarily deal with what I would consider successful restaurant clusters or bar and restaurant clusters. And so it's not, in my mind, unexpected that there is parking supply issues there, but the remainder of the parking district is largely open at 7 p.m. So once again, expanding the parking permit option at this point does not appear to be overly problematic on its face right now. If we were to offer it and see that it was, we could always modify things later. But I think staff remains open to the possibility that these 2 nodes relate to successful businesses and not to an overrun of residential parkers, because as you'll see by 11 p.m. All but one of those locations is clear for parking. So the very southern, or I should say the one block of the Oakland Capitol intersection is parked full, but there's only 2 or 3 parking spaces there at 11 p.m. I don't know that that's bothering anyone. So once again, my interpretation of this analysis and of these charts is that supply is there. And if it's there and people want to use it, I feel like it should be priced appropriately that people have access to it. So once again, just staff's perspectives of the questions that were asked. So summarizing, there are pockets of success within the business district. It'd be a matter of enforcement or perception if people think that there's not parking, identifying why that is the case. It's also possible to modify the daytime regulations if proven problematic. So for example, I believe those districts currently are signed for 2-hour parking 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. So in theory, you could park your car there at 4:30 and not move it until 9:30 in the morning. And if that is problematic for the district or for the businesses, the village could consider expanding that to say, 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., which would mean that you couldn't park there overnight until 8 p.m. So there are ways of adjusting that without, throwing the whole system into flux. I think, once again, this is kind of you need to test the waters to see where the problems are. So I don't want to overbuild the system if we don't have to. Projected demand will relate to, the renter majority housing stock that we have and whether or not they actually do have excess demand that's pent up. We did, in response to that question that the board offered, offer a general parking survey and a permit holder parking survey. I went to planning school. I'm going to fully admit these surveys are not scientific nor representative, but they do offer some perspective. We just don't have the time or a capacity to do something that's specific within this time frame. There is clear demand shown for the permit, so I think on some level that confirms why we're here discussing it. The pricing options also, not surprisingly, confirm that increased demand happens with reduced price. So if you offer it for $30, more people will purchase it than if you offer it for $50. So once again, that's how you balance that to find equilibrium in the system. And then we did offer a general, give us your comments. We were kind of overrun with them. I think there's 23 pages of comments, 360.
Wow.
Yeah, I think it was 360 people ended up giving comments. So this is a hot topic for at least.
Yeah, that's a good response rate. That's amazing.
Yeah. Unfortunately, if that's the word, the comments are pretty split of people saying don't offer it or people saying why isn't this offered now. So I don't know that there's a majority consensus within the comments other than that it proves that once again we have kind of a split community in renter versus homeowner perspective, or long time versus short time resident. So it isn't an easy policy decision, and so I don't envy yourself or the board in making that, but I feel like we've given a lot of information in terms of how to make that decision, including the comments that you're more than welcome to pour through. They're in the packet. So a general survey response. So this was for people just through the village manager's memo primarily and through social media. So we asked people, at certain price levels, would you purchase a permit? So we'll start in the upper left corner. At $60 for an on-street permit or $50 for an overnight off-street permit, 77% of people said they still would purchase neither. So a majority of people said they still wouldn't do it, don't need it. Is this representative? I would argue it probably is not, but it's something. And at $60, 17% or 18% would purchase the on-street, but a smaller amount would purchase the off-street. So once again, as you'll see, all the blue segments here are larger than the red. People do prefer the on-street option, which then supports the consultant's analysis that the on-street should be priced higher than the off-street. Going down the line, if they're both 50, slightly more people would purchase it. You're down to 72, so they wouldn't. 24%, so they would do on-street. Then if we reduce it to $50 for an on-street, and $40 for off-street, gotta get my number straight here. More people then start moving towards the off-street option because it does get cheaper, but still more people with the on-street. And then lastly, the cheapest option that we were including was $40 for the $40 for the on-street, $30 for the off-street. Once again, 62 or 63% still said they still would not purchase it, but the number does increase to 30% for the on-street. So once again, if people were to purchase it, it seems like that's their option or their preference, but the majority of people still would not be purchasing it. So in terms of—
Is it renters or renters and owners,
So yeah, we didn't get down to the level of renters versus owners or anything like that. I will say our village manager's memo and our typical survey response is predominantly homeowners. So for example, our community survey last year, I think 82% of respondents were homeowners. And so we generally find that to be the case. So I'd be comfortable assuming that this is primarily homeowners. Renters, I think, would be higher. The general survey. And then we did do a specific survey to permit holders. So these people that already purchased permits.
Okay.
Once again, the blue option is preferred. People would rather park on street than off street. It's closer to their house. Not everyone lives near a lot. For all the options, they're in your packet for you. But once again, it bears the result of the cheaper you make it, the more people that will purchase it. So if in fact there is concern over a lack of supply, it would make sense to, start at a higher price or raise the price to kind of equilibrate that demand. But once again, it's a matter of policy at that point.
Okay.
So with permit costs, there's been discussion at both the advisory group and at the village board of why charge anything. I don't think that's the majority opinion, but we have heard it from several people. Just want to remind everyone that permit fees do pay for the administration of the parking program. The village does have software, which I mentioned before, has a cost for the free permission, so we absorb that elsewhere. There are software costs. There are also administrative costs for personnel for enforcement, which under any circumstance cannot go away, because if you don't enforce it, people won't be buying the permit. So enforcement, customer service who administer the questions and process the applications, as well as DPW staff who maintains the various lots that people park in. So there are costs that the permit fees do pay for directly within those categories. And then within the private lots, we share those revenues with the private lot holder. So we can't reduce it to zero without eating that cost per se. And then also we do pay pilot fees, payment in lieu of taxes, which essentially act as though the parking lot is a business entity. So there are some things built into those models. All of the finance director's more specific fiscal impact statements within the packet include those as rows within the statement. So long story short, offering it for free would require that we eat those costs elsewhere. A lower permit fee could cover these costs, and maybe a higher fee could cover other costs, but that's where we come in from today. I also provided previous perspective that on-street parking is not a public good. A lot of people in the comments believe, that their taxes already pay for it. Why should we charge anything? Definitely a perspective worth sharing. I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong. I just want to point out that public parking is not a public good. There is limited capacity. So if I take it, my neighbor can't. And so there is competition for it. The price can be determined. It's not as though you can't figure out what the market would bear. The price in theory does control supply. So if there's issues with supply, you in theory could raise the price and less people would purchase it and balance it out that way. So it's a market-based system. And providing the permit does mitigate negative impacts or perceived negative impacts that people have either with, availability or aesthetics or perceived crime. So there are arguments on both sides or arguments on all sides. I'm just providing the perspective that from my perspective, it's not a free public good. There are negative impacts with auto dominance in our culture. So that's, boring planner speak. And then I guess to the question at hand primarily, there were 3 options provided. One for a $60 on-street parking permit, $50 off-street, then a $50 on-street, $40 off-street, $40 on-street, $30 off-street, so progressively lower. Obviously, the first scenario, which actually raises the price on various users, has a net impact of $31,330. That's not the goal of this. It's not to either be revenue neutral or revenue positive. Just saying that if that were the desire of the policymakers, that's what would result in it. The costs are split out between general revenue and parking utility because budgetary wise, those are important differences. So scenario 2, where you'd offer the $50 on-street permit and the $40 off-street permit, actually shows a positive revenue within the general revenue category because on-street permits go to general revenue. But the off-street we project would then go down, and that's a loss of $36,000, roughly 37. Just for reference sake, that parking utility pays a $40,000 payment in lieu of taxes every year. So under this scenario, that payment likely would need to go away and be made up in some other budget category. So our finance director has advised that, if the advisory group or the board wants to go that way, it's not a problem. We can and will find places to either move sources around or, have the hard conversation of cutting services on some level. But anything lower than option 2 would cause more severe discussions. So option 3 would be the cheaper option, $40 on street, $30 off street. That shows a negative balance in both categories. So we would be losing both general revenue and parking utility to the total of roughly $90,000. Once again, that's a policy decision and would need to be discussed within the upcoming budget as to where those monies are found or saved elsewhere. So we're not saying they can't be recommended. If equity and or a belief that the permit should be cheaper are the will of the group, that's completely fine. Just giving you the heads up of where we come from for this year's budget cycle. So just a summary of staff's perspective, the $60 on-street permit does appear to be too costly. Surveys bear that out compared to our neighbors that also is higher. It would actually increase the current fee for hardship and special permits. They're paying $50 a month. So if we replace that with this option and charge them $60, we're actually increasing the fee. Once again, that was not the goal of the study. So I would argue as a staff perspective, we don't think that option should be considered. Reduced off-street revenue will require budgetary considerations under the other 2 scenarios, but they can be done. However, scenario 3 shows a lot more severe impacts. I'll also say these are all just projections. We actually don't know, who will purchase these permits. These are based on, surveys and history of who has purchased them in the past. So with that, we would be recommending the middle option, which is the $50 on-street. That maintains the existing price for hardship and special permit. So it's expanding the opportunity, but not changing the price. It does reduce the price for off-street to incentivize people to consider purchasing that and keeping those revenues within those categories. So we would be recommending that middle option with a discussion to reevaluate within 6 months after we see the impacts. So at that point, we would know who's purchasing it. And possibly if enough people are purchasing either option, we could reduce them. If they're not, we could change things. We could modify daytime restrictions. But if you were to ask for our humble perspective, we think the middle option would be the most implementable within the time frame suggested. So I just spoke for too long on a bunch of topics that you've already heard before, so I apologize if I've said too much. But in general, what we're here for tonight—
I commend you, Bart, for your command of it and for your doing, I mean, you do a lot of these meetings, and I want to commend you for your intuitiveness and your rigor. So,
well, much appreciated. Thank you, Leonard. And
I notice, I definitely notice.
You guys are volunteers too, so I appreciate you taking the time out to, on behalf of your village. So the 3 questions that we're here for tonight that the board kind of asked for more discussion on are right in front of us here. So should proof of residency be required? Should we limit the number of permits per household? And ultimately the $1 million question is, what price should be charged if we were to offer one? So with that, I'm happy to turn it over for your perspectives, and we can take it from there.
I don't need to be the first one to speak, but I have an opinion.
I can go first if you want me to.
Great.
A couple things. I was not privy to the conversation on July the 6th. I wasn't at that committee the whole meeting, so this is a little bit of fresh eyes for me. Trying to look at this kind of from an equity type lens, and from looking at the village, at the staff recommendations too, and taking those into account. The proof of residency thing, it seems to me that, I don't know, first of all, there's an administrative burden. I would think people would probably self-select whether they wanted an overnight permit in Shorewood. I just think we might be solving a problem that is not that big a problem. So I probably, my gut feeling, and again, I don't know that, I obviously reserve the right to have further discussion on this prior to the Monday meeting and get resident feedback, things like that. But my gut feeling is that I don't know that we need to pursue proof of residency. It just seems like it doesn't seem like it would be a huge problem, and it creates administrative burden for staff. Limited number per household. I'm not a huge fan of that either. I mean, you see different household setups now. You see multi-generational households. Again, I don't know that we need to do that. And I don't think a lot of households would be requesting 2, 3, 4, 5 permits. I just don't. I think we're, again, trying to solve a problem that may or may not exist. The price, I'm fine with going with staff recommendation. I mean, ideally, you'd want a 0 fiscal impact, especially in this COVID environment. But I do understand these numbers are all projections. Therefore, they could change. They could move around more or less. We don't quite know. And $60 does seem pretty expensive for this. From a personal standpoint, as an aside, on August 3rd, just thank you to this committee. I'm a newcomer here completely and totally. You guys have done great work, a ton of work. I'm a little bit, for me personally, looking at kind of the issues you still have to work through at the board level, and knowing that masks are on the agenda for the 3rd, I don't know that we're going to get through all this on the 3rd. I'm a little bit skeptical, but I really do look forward to your recommendation coming out of those 3 questions. But those are my thoughts for what it's worth.
And just to kind of—
I want to jump. Can I jump on that real quick?
Go for it, Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Bart. So I absolutely agree with Wes on points 1 and 2 for sure, and not that I disagree with him on price charge. I guess I had this thought while I was listening to all of this, and if this has been taken into consideration, if it's an option, if it's not, I don't know. If it's been discussed and I missed it, I apologize. But would it be possible, by any chance, to establish a price based on median income in Shorewood and then prorate based on people's income, if we're looking at pricing from an equity standpoint? It's done with housing. Could it be done with parking?
Yeah, that gets into administrative, you know, kind of nightmares for me in terms of asking people to fix with their income and then, you know, reviewing that and then offering them a permit. I don't know that people want to be providing the village, you know, whether it's open records request or otherwise, with proof of that. And so I personally,
That's,
yeah.
it's kind of what I figured. So just wanted to throw it out there. So I'm kind of in the same camp as Wes. I'm like, I'm not sure about the pricing piece. So I'm anxious to hear what others have to say. I'll be quiet now.
Just to follow up on Trustee Warren's final point about August 3rd, I spoke with Village Manager Ewald today as well. The reason that we're, you know, bringing this back to you guys and back to the board at this time is because there are budgetary impacts. And so it's not as though, I don't want you to be perceived that I'm trying to push, you know, that we have to make a decision or that, you know, just for that perspective, I just want to share, we as staff acknowledge that there are budgetary impacts to this. And so that's why we're kind of pushing the conversation to get some perspective. If the board, you know, has other items on August 3rd agenda that push this, that's how life works, you know? So I'm just prepared for if and when they're prepared for it, I'm there for it. So to Trustee Warren's point, it might not happen August 3rd, but if it does, I just want to be prepared. So the budget is upon us next month.
Yeah, I appreciate that part. I'm not, that wasn't meant as a criticism. It's just the board is, you know, I can tell you the board is being pulled in a lot of different directions. The pandemic with social justice, and this, I don't want to give this kind of the short end of the stick in terms of the consideration, especially given the work this group has done. So that's my only concern. So thank you. Not meant as a criticism.
Yep, not taking it. Yep, we're good.
Go ahead, Rachel.
You just want to go last.
No,
My dinner arrived, so I'm motivated.
I don't want all the men to go first and have the woman be last.
What do you mean? We're all equal.
The mansplaining stuff.
No, I agree. I think proof of residency is aggravating and annoying for everybody. As someone who has to do it every year for school, ugh, yuck. I can't imagine spending 30% of my time on that. That would be awful. So I'm not a huge fan of that. I think the TOSA method is fine. And if we find that we have a problem or we suspect a lot of shenanigans, we at least have certifications we can go back to and be like, hey, you said you were a resident, you're not, blah, 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 blah. Limited number per household, you know, per Bart's description, we can't do that if we don't have proof of residency. So that's moot, in my opinion. And then what price should be charged? I think the middle option is fine. I think we should reevaluate after 6 months or whatever period you think is appropriate. I personally think it should be lower. But if we start with the middle option, we do some analysis, the loss is not what we expected, we can lower the price and that would be a big happy moment for everybody. Whereas if we started with the lower one and found that we are losing more than we thought, raising it would be very difficult. So my opinion would be to go with the middle and then reevaluate.
Okay.
To follow up on, oh, just real quick, Leonard, sorry. To follow up on what points, so Milwaukee, they're the ones that have the disclaimer. They did say that occasionally you get people, I don't know, tattling on or whatever, that they end up, they do research and void permits. So not surprisingly, it could be also the case here, but I feel like that system is less likely than having to, you know, look through residency paperwork. So still, yeah,
that's focused enforcement. So if someone, gosh darn it, if someone's going to spend the time of their day to do that, God bless them. Because I don't have that time.
I have a question about that. Oh,
the cost of our permit might dissuade people from trying to do that. In Milwaukee, where it's cheap, trying to get into that system, but here, I'm not sure.
Yeah, and in the areas where we don't really have a problem, it's like, let's accept some revenue from outside the village. Let's bring it. If there's an occupant complaint, then we'll deal with it. So, Katie, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Kate.
sorry, it's hard because I can't see. So, but I just was wondering, in terms of the permits and not occupancy, which I completely agree with. I'm just thinking about caregivers or, you know, family who's taking care of an older adult or someone here. You know, is the assumption then that that would be inappropriate for that person to get that? Or is it sort of, we're not asking, you know, it's for people who need it for whether it's work or family caregiving or whatever it might be, but they could benefit if they're willing to pay for it. That's fine. Just something to think about.
Yeah, and that was part of staff's perspective last year and within this analysis is that we do acknowledge caregivers do request parking currently. We
Mhm.
And we assume that some people get around it other ways. But we think that offering it to employees or caregivers who are non-residents makes sense. It's a benefit to the resident to have that person come there. So it was part of the staff's perspective on why residency shouldn't be required, because we do acknowledge that that is the need for several households.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I can't imagine it's a huge number, but I can think of a few examples where I know, people come and stay with parents, or parents come and stay with young children, or whatever it might be.
Yep.
And maybe part of the test period is we have that checkbox and we don't change our decision either way. We just kind of get a feel for how many people are asking for it that are residents or aren't. And then at that 6-month period, we decide what we want to do with that information.
I like that idea, Rachel.
That's a good point, though. I mean, even if you're in a steady relationship with somebody who lives in Franklin, if that's your thing, they're coming, they're staying the night, they're staying more than 20 nights. It makes sense to have that option if it's a source of revenue for the village and there's no complaint.
Yeah, good point.
Okay. Leonard here. I think I agree with the first two, no proof of residency. I don't think it would end up being much of a problem. So few people, non-residents getting into this. So I just think no proof of residency. Don't limit the number per household. But I do think the price should be lower. And I just, I do like the 40. And I just know that what a struggle it is for renters. Our renters are, small 1-bedrooms, 750 to 800. And the price of $50 would be is a barrier, even though $40 is a lot. So it's very it does have an impact on the renters. So I'm wanting the $40.
Yep, and I appreciate that perspective. So with the option 2 that we were discussing, as you mentioned, we would be reducing the off-street. So if someone's parking off-street, this actually could be a benefit to them, but we also acknowledge that not all apartment buildings are close to those lots. So there is some kind of, consideration of paying for the access to it. So
those lots are a hike for a lot of people.
Correct. Yep.
It's a barrier because they're so far away.
Yeah, especially with groceries or kids.
So I see Jake is not on the call representing the bid tonight, and maybe I'll ask for his perspective specifically outside of this meeting if I need to, but I'm curious if there's any thoughts from this group on terms of competition with the business district. I'll admit I don't park in the business district at night, so I don't see what it looks like at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock. Does anyone have any perspectives on whether or not they think this will be overly problematic?
From what? Sorry, Bart.
I am.
Go ahead. All right.
Okay. I was going to say I'm often by Shore West late at night, so kind of on the very, very northern end of the business district. And the parking is definitely, even now when it's only outside dining, pretty maxed out. I mean, I tend to park in the lot there, but if I do try to park on the street, it's sort of hit or miss. So I do think there could be competition at that end, which I think was the study also showed that was the spot that had the most demand into the evening, right?
Yeah, I think the study kind of alluded that the demand is driven by the businesses, not by overnight parking, but clearly it's a little bit of,
yes,
because by 11 o'clock, the supply was back. And so a lot of that occupancy between 7 and 11 p.m. was presumably for business customers. And so just from our perspective, that's what the data is showing us. So that's where we're coming.
Yeah, so I guess I'm thinking more like 8 or 9 if we're looking at that time where there's that overlap between overnight parkers and business. That could be a busy window.
And yeah, so to that point, we could consider modifying the daytime regulations either in that area or throughout the whole business district to extend the 6 p.m. to say 10 p.m. Therefore, when you get home at 6 p.m., you couldn't park on, that part of Oakland without facing a 2-hour ticket. So I think personally, that's probably the smarter way to modify that concern if that is a concern moving forward. So.
Can you refresh my memory? If someone has a parking permit, can they park anywhere in Shorewood?
So the special permits offered through landlords, those are limited to Wilson Drive, Oakland, and Capitol, and I believe like maybe the block around the corner from each of those. So, but not full village wide.
Okay, is there a reason to consider just letting someone park anywhere in the village? I know the homeowners don't like to have cars parked in front of their houses, but you know, so what?
Yeah, I mean, this proposal would not have limitations on where they could park. So it replaces a more burdensome system. To your point, we could modify the current system and just remove that. So I don't want to offer this without, you know, I'll just say it right. So if for some reason the board doesn't want to adopt this policy after we've discussed it, there are smaller implementation mechanisms that we could use. At the July meeting, someone offered, why can't we just change the hardship requirements? Definitely could. It's not as open for everyone else. But to your point, change hardships, we could modify the special permits. It's not going to get rid of the administrative burden on us. It's not going to expand it to other people. So this was what the study recommended. So this is what we're going forward with. If for some reason, like I said, we don't get consensus or there's a lot of opposition to this, we could do smaller interim measures. I don't know that that was the goal of the analysis, but yeah, it's out there.
Okay. The executive order, get around the Congress approach.
So I guess if there's any other thoughts on night parking, otherwise, I feel like, I'll just summarize, I heard a consensus to not require residency or household permits, at least at this time, but maybe in 6 months if we had to revisit it. Suggestion of maybe asking people when they do purchase the permit to identify so that we could, you know, get an idea of people that are not purchasing it from the village, just for number's sake. So I think there's pretty clear consensus on those two. And then I heard an acceptance at least of the staff recommendation for 50-40, but I did hear at least a small minority, you know, suggesting that still, if lower was possible, lower would be preferred.
Not that small of a minority.
Can I chime in?
Yep.
Yeah, I think that, you know, where I would kind of hope to land is, you know, I think right now I'm good with the staff's recommendation. I agree though that the goal here is to get cheaper if we can. You know, like I would like to offer it for less. I view this as kind of a starting point. So I mean, to the extent that I think we're all kind of aligned in that cheaper is better.
Okay.
It's just kind of the question is where we start.
Yep, I'm seeing heads nod there. So, so if you're comfortable with me presenting that to the board, that's what I'm going to suggest is that the advisory group was accepting to staff's recommendation, but still desired to make it cheaper if possible. So the board, at least, you know, understand where you're coming from on that.
Great.
Okay, well, that kind of sums up my parking discussion. I want to briefly introduce the topic of ADA parking to everyone to get their ideas going for future discussion and consideration. This was one of the village manager's primary tasks that she wanted to get accomplished this year. So I don't see her on the call, so I volunteered to do this on her behalf. She did present the memo that hopefully you had a chance to read or can read. So the current regulations regarding ADA in the village, just want to reiterate that ADA on-street parking is what we're talking about here, is not required by the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act. And so there's no general requirement that we do it. However, locally, we have authorized approval of on-street ADA parking spaces through the village manager. That was through the previous village manager, and he had his own system of doing things in terms of, you know, administration, which were shared within the packet as well. However, the analysis did suggest modifying the previous, or I should say the current system. Just for reference, we have recently modified regulations in the village regarding loading zones and parklets to require them to be paid for by special privileges. An ADA parking stall, quite honestly, isn't much different. It's a reservation of on-street parking space for a specific user, whether that's a shipment of, you know, goods to your bar or restaurant or an on-street dining. So the conversation staff internally was at least that ADA acts very similar to special privileges, which we do on a very specific process. So our minds were thinking perhaps that might be a better way to go. The analysis did recommend to allow ADA parking on street. So they're saying ADA isn't required federally, but it's a good idea and it's a welcoming, thing to do for people that need it. Their only limitation was to limit it to 1 per block. Not every block is the same, so that 1 per block is weird. And then, quite honestly, if there's 2 people on a block that need it, how do you tell one person that they don't get it? So it just gets into administrative, fights that staff, quite honestly, isn't capable of solving. Those requests were to be reviewed by customer service, but I should say received by customer service, but reviewed and installed by Public Works. So if we were to adopt the method recommended within the analysis, we would likely have to do a policy on, how Public Works does review those. I don't think that staff is necessarily recommending that we follow that recommendation. So we just want to kind of discuss this with everyone here and get the room temperature of the room. For reference, the city of Milwaukee follows PROAG, which is like, I want to say public right-of-way something guidance. I apologize, accessibility guidance probably. So that's what the city of Milwaukee follows. That specifically says that it allows and provides ADA stalls when they're marked or metered. So in residential areas where it's just general on-street parking, they don't actually reserve ADA stalls, so not in residential streets. If we were to follow that in the village of Shorewood, I believe the only marked spaces we actually have in terms of car markings are on Capitol. I think Oakland just has a parking lane, but not a number of spaces. Residential streets are not even actually painted for that. So if we were to follow the city of Milwaukee, we would be, kind of changing course and saying that we're not going to specifically approve them. But there's also possibly a middle ground, like I mentioned, with loading zones, special privileges, kind of things like that. So where we're at for discussion tonight is where does this group necessarily see ADA parking going? Do you have thoughts on Walker's broad approach where there'd be 1 per block with a policy of how to administer that? Or maybe Milwaukee's more clear approach of following the national PROAG standards, but keep in mind that essentially would disallow them in residential areas. That might be completely fine, and quite honestly, it's very easy to administer, but it is kind of a different approach. Is there a middle ground, possibly where people could apply for them, similar to a special privilege? If so, are there thoughts on commercial versus residential differences on those? So I hate to just throw this out to the group, but we're kind of here just like to hear your thoughts on this, and we'll bring back a more formal proposal or policy at a future meeting. But the questions that we're throwing out there are, if we need to define a block, what's your definition of block? Should there be differences between residential and commercial ADA parking? Should the village be more proactive in terms of identifying where they go in the commercial district, or reactive based on someone's application for it? Should we charge them an annual fee for them? And if you get one, how long is it good for? Part of the problem we have right now is we have ADA stalls that were approved, possibly 5-10 years ago that we quite honestly do not follow up on. The person might have moved for all that we know, and it's still out there. So until someone complains or tells us about it. So quite honestly, I think an annual review at a minimum would be necessary. So just kind of getting the temperature of the room. Like I said, this is going to be teed up for a future conversation. So if you have any thoughts, feel free to let me know.
Do you want me to go first again? Am I the?
Sounds good.
Yes.
I mean, my sense is this is kind of it falls into kind of a right thing to do category. It seems like we should implement this and implement it as broadly as possible, be as proactive as possible. I'm not a big fan of the limitations. I mean, if we have an issue there, I think we solve that problem if it comes up, but this seems like something that we should do. We talk a lot about inclusivity. This is a key component of that. If somebody needs a space, they need a space, and I don't see why we would make that. I don't see why we should want to facilitate that and not make that more difficult. So I'm fully in support of doing this as broadly as we can, as proactively as we can, and not kind of placing limits around it that don't need to be placed. I'm not, following Milwaukee would essentially it feels like it would gut the ability to do this, so I don't want to do that. Again, I'm looking to get broader, not less broad. Just my thoughts.
Can I just clarify, by ADA spaces, are you talking about painting it blue like a handicap parking spot? Is that what that is?
So we don't have a lot of spaces that we would paint necessarily, but we would sign them off. So there's a handful of examples around the village where, you know, in front of someone's house, we'll have 2 poles and say ADA parking in between these 2 poles or these 2 signs.
Okay, okay, I get it.
Paint the street
Okay.
necessarily, but it would just mark it for, and that's a good point. Anyone with an ADA plate or sticker or whatnot could park there. So it's not necessarily reserved parking for a particular person. It's just acknowledging that someone in that area needs one or uses one. So there'd probably be some, you know, sighting standards where, you know, we wouldn't put it in certain places perhaps, but if the desire was to be more broad, I think we could define those standards pretty easily.
Okay.
So to that point, if it's not belonging to a particular individual, is the cost a question of cost to village? That fourth bullet there?
Yeah, I think the cost, quite honestly, I mean, if it initially relates to signage, you know, so there is a definite cost of installing a sign. Is the village willing to, you know, take that on behalf of the applicant, or is that something that we want to charge them for? The other thing that kind of drove that conversation was if a business is requesting it for their customers, you know, it's something the business should be paying for because they're saying my customers need this, and it's kind of similar to a parklet or a loading zone at that point. So maybe in a commercial request, there's a cost for it. For a residential, maybe we have a different cost or no cost at all. Once again, all these things that can be easily worked out in a quick policy draft. Yep.
Yeah, and there was a question about schools too, right? Does that fall into this? I know that at Lake Bluff there was a question about that towards the end of when we were in school.
So yeah,
about having a drop-off area that was ADA.
Yeah, the one at the school was actually a loading zone, not a parking stall. So they applied through the current loading zone standards, so that it got itself worked out.
Okay.
Sorry.
That makes sense.
Yep, Trustee Warren.
Sorry, I don't want to monopolize the conversation here, but I realized I didn't address cost, and I'm not a big fan of cost for either business or residential. I just think the last thing we want to do is disincent business to request these spaces if they feel they're necessary. So I wouldn't want to pass along those costs and end up having a business say, well, you know, I would, but I have to pay $300 for the signage, and I don't really want to do that, so I'm not going to request it. You know, I don't want to create that negative incentive, so I just prefer not to pass along costs.
Okay.
Yeah, I can go next. I got to drop at 7 for a work call. I agree with Trustee Warren. I think we want to be more opening and exclusive and inclusive. I almost said exclusive, and welcoming. From the bike and ped perspective, we totally feel that we want to encourage biking and walking to the downtown district. So one of the things that we always hear when we talk about like closing a road or changing things around the village is, you know, how do we ensure that people who can't walk or bike have access to that same area? And by having reserved spots for them, it sort of diffuses that conversation just a little bit. So I think I could speak for the committee and say that we would support this as a way to welcome other methods of transport and maybe have a little bit of incentive to have folks walk a little bit or bike.
I guess I kind of go for a broader approach, even though in general, I don't have an opinion.
Has that come up with any of your tenants that you're aware of in terms of? No?
Not that I know of.
Is Katie still on the phone?
Yeah, I think she dropped. Is there any discussion about like the curb? Like, would there be any effort to like ramp it?
So there has been discussion on that. It's not, once again, it's not required.
Okay.
It becomes required if you have it signed and then you redo the road and you maintain the signs, then at that point you have to modify the curb to allow it.
Okay.
So it's one of those things where
Sneaky.
you're not required to do it until you, like, we're going to put money into the street and we've identified that needs to be ADA. At that point you do. So where that would come in likely would be something like Atwater Beach or other parks where we might want to sign proactively for those users. If we were to redo Lake Drive, which we understand will be happening, you know, probably in the next 5 years, at that point, then we would be required to modify the curb at that point. But I don't think there's discussion of doing it until greater improvements are planned.
Yeah, I got to drop off. I support additional discussion on this, and I think it makes Charlotte more welcoming and inclusive, and I'm on board.
Yeah, and I think staff was expecting a similar application approach as opposed to Milwaukee's, approach or Walker's undefined approach. So I think we're good with that, and we'll bring back a policy perhaps within the next month or so with more specifics, and then hopefully you can provide some perspective on that, and we can get this one implemented this year yet. So we're looking forward to it. I have, unless someone else has
Okay, I
anything
got to
else.
drop, guys.
All right,
Thanks a lot,
Rachel.
Bart.
Bye,
Thanks,
Rachel.
guys. See ya.
Anyone else have any thoughts? Otherwise, I'd be willing to adjourn the group if necessary.
Yeah, I'm done.
So yeah, August 3rd, we'll be at the board. If it gets taken up, we'll see. If either way, I'll provide an update to the group and we'll go from there.
Great. Okay, Bart. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. Have a good night.
Okay, bye.
Thanks, Bart.
Yep.